Hey everyone. So in this video, I want to talk about a common problem with RBD simulations, and that is scale. So what I have here is a small scale, and that is a little card house. So let me quickly delete my RBD bullet solver, and then we create a fresh one later on. So what I did here is pretty straightforward. It's just a grid to create one card, and then I transform it so it builds a little, roof or whatever you call it, and then copy that a couple of times with a copy and transform, and then I use a connectivity node so that every single one of the cards has a clear identifier, and I use that to always kill one for every step. So always kill the last one and then move the whole thing up a little bit, and the first one as well, so always two. And then I do that a couple of times and merge the whole thing together, and in the end I have a little house here. Okay, great. Nothing too fancy. What I also made sure is that the scale is roughly correct. So if we look here and we have a Tommy in place, you can see it's about right. Maybe not perfect, but at least it's not completely off. So this is about the size of a real card house. Okay. So what you have to understand is that RBD, when it was built with a couple of kind of limitations, or well, more optimizations actually. So the idea is that they wanted the whole system to be as fast as possible, and to do that they had to decide certain basic assumptions, and one of them is that the scale it works best in, and that is roughly the scale of a couple of meters. So it's mainly made for buildings that are destroyed, or I don't know, spaceships and mech warriors or whatever, something like that. So this kind of scale. But it's not really that great for a scale that is much smaller or much bigger than that. And especially the smaller ones are surprisingly tricky. And this is what we have here. So let's have a look what happens if we create from scratch a new bullet solver. Here we go. And the first thing that happens if I run this, it falls through the ground. So let's make sure we actually have a ground. There you go. And now let's see what happens. Okay, so that's weird. It behaves really crazy. Some of them are kind of floating in space, other ones keeps jiggling, and it's all a bit weird. So what's going on here? The first thing I would recommend is, if something like that happens, always check what you're actually simulating right now. So remember, we talked about this before. Under visualize, you should always check the geometry representation. If you can already see the first problem, this is what's actually simulated. So that's the first problem. The RBD simulation usually gives every geometry a little bit of additional thickness to the thickness it already has. And in our case, that's just too high in the small scale we work in. When you work in a bigger scale, then this kind of additional thickness doesn't matter. But in a small scale like this, as you can see, is a big problem. So where do we solve this? Under solver bullet object, right in the beginning under bullet data, there is a collision padding of 002, which is again for big scale relatively small, but for like this it's too high. So let's lower this to maybe something like 001, and you can see now it's much thinner. I mean, it's up to you what kind of scale you want to choose. I would always go a bit higher with the thickness if you can afford it. It will make the whole system a bit more stable. So this is already much better. Let's run this again. What you can see kind of is it became a bit slower than before. I'm not sure if you can see that, but I can tell you that. And that is not because this whole simulation really became slower, but because now it kind of has to put in the showing of the geometry representation. So just like we talked before, I would recommend turning this off because it slows down the whole actually visualization of the simulation, not the simulation itself. So it's a good idea to turn it off after you don't need it anymore. So if I run this again, you can see it's much faster. And it solved a couple of problems. So as you can see, nothing is floating in the air anymore. It actually falls down, but it now becomes really angry. So they kind of jiggle around and kind of complain about what's going on, and it looks really weird. So what's going on here? So before I move on, I have to say that keep in mind RBD in general, or bullet in general, is pretty unstable. So the solution I show you now, I can't guarantee you that it works in every case, and every case is a little bit different and needs a little bit different solution maybe for this problem. And also you will see other people might find different ways of solving this. I can only show the stuff that I found, and I can't guarantee that it works for everything, but in my tests, those steps that I show you were always pretty helpful, at least. So the first thing I would recommend is when you work with something like this, you should make sure that you should actually not work with flat geometries. That creates a lot of problems. So what I already built in up here is a poly extrude. That doesn't mean that you have to render this. Remember, we talked about this before. You can replace your simulation geometry with another render geometry later. This is purely for simulation. I would always give things a little bit of thickness, even if they're flat, before they go into the RBD bullet solver. That solves a lot of problems. Another thing is maybe actually I made a little bit of a mistake here. This thickness sometimes can be a bit too thin. So maybe on the safer side would be something like this. Let's double check the thickness. It should still be totally fine. Yeah, you can see that's still fine. But be careful that you don't put the collision padding too low, and never put it to 0. So that is one. That will not solve the problem though. That's just kind of the preparation to make it easier later to do what the solution actually is, and especially when we look at it, that we don't get Z fighting and stuff like this. So the solution is actually pretty funny and kind of stupid. We just scale the whole thing up so that it is again in the scale area that works well with bullet. I know that sounds a bit silly, but hear me out, because I can prove to you that this is actually an official solution. So let me quickly show you by hand what we would do. We just scale the whole thing up by 10, and then afterwards we scale it down by the opposite, so that we're back to the original size. And if I just run this, you will see that it instantly behaves more stable. The problem is basically gone. But of course, the problem now is that everything behaves as it was, 10 times bigger. So the size of a human being, for example, which doesn't necessarily look realistic. The solution here could be, depending on the forces you have, in our case, we only have the gravity force to deal with. We just scale the gravity up, not necessarily by 10, but something that feels right. So for example, -30, so that everything falls down quicker. And you can see, while the jittering is not 100% gone, it's much better, and it still feels more or less realistic. That this is actually a solution, I can prove to you by deleting the whole thing and bring it back to the basics. Because this exact solution is already built in the bullet solver by side effects. Under advanced, right, the first thing is called bullet world scale. And what you can do here is you can put in the number 10 again, and then it does the same thing kind of internally. It's not, of course, scaling it up, simulating it, and scaling it down. What it actually does is it just changes all the numbers by this factor. But what is important about this number here, and why it's better, is that it multiplies also the forces, so that we are back to a behavior that is correct for the scale we have. And here you can see we basically have this. Now, there's still a little bit of jittering, as you can see, and that is because just changing the word scale is not enough. For some reason, I'm not 100% sure why. When you do that, you should also increase the substeps. And you don't have to be afraid of increasing them quite a bit. You can, just do it roughly, but in our case, let's just do it by 10 to 100. And this will still be pretty fast, because that is one of the few great things about bullet. It's really fast. So if we run this again, you can see we have the same behavior as before, but it's stable. And that is because we increased the substeps. Be careful though. This is something I really don't want you to remember in the wrong way. The increasing the substeps in bullet is very often a very bad idea. And to prove that, let me quickly go back and turn the bullet scale off, but keep the substeps on 100, and let's see what happens. This happens, it explodes. So this is one of the problems I have with bullet. It's not very logical very often. It's not scalable. So just because this substep of 100 works on a bullet scale of 10 doesn't mean it also works on a smaller scale. So be careful with that. All I'm saying is when you increase the bullet word scale, also increase the substeps. I'm not saying that increasing the substep is generally a good idea, because it isn't. I would actually highly recommend not touching the substeps in bullet too much, especially not by 10. Usually that creates a lot of problems, but in this particular case, when working with a bullet word scale, this can make a lot of sense. And as you can see here, it stabilizes the system, while in other cases it destabilizes the system. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, so this is the important one, is that there is still a little bit of jittering maybe. So if we go really close, you can see that there's might be still a little bit of that. Maybe here. It's not too bad. Here, there in the back it is. It's not too bad, so here we can get away without it, but I just want to let you know a little bit of jitter, this kind of super fine jitter that doesn't really kind of comes from nowhere, and basically what you want here is the pieces to, you know, they have settled and they should stand still. Remember that you have under advanced bullet solver, you have a sleeping time, and you could use that here to your advantage. So if we set it to a lower number, that means if a card is stable and not moving for half a second, then that means it will be basically turned off. And this is why at some point that then stops. So maybe here in this particular case, 1 would be the better number. So again, this depends a little bit on the case. And maybe it doesn't even work here when it behaves like that. Okay, fair enough. So maybe in this case 2 was fine, but just as a tip, you could use the sleeping time for something like this to your advantage if you time it correctly to your case. But in this case it was fine, just keep it in mind. Okay, so you can see it's a bit esoteric, to be fair, but at least it's already built in so that you can see it actually works. Just scale it up, sim it again with higher numbers and scale it back down, and this is already built in. Just keep in mind when you do that, it usually helps and stabilizes the system to increase the substeps. It doesn't have to be 100. The interesting thing about bullet is, as you can see here, by changing the substeps, you actually do change the behavior of the whole simulation, which is another thing to keep in mind. So in this case, a 70 might have been better depending on what you want, and creates a different result. So always keep that in mind. That's just how bullet is. Yeah, so keep that in mind when you work with small scale RBD simulations. Make sure that your geometry has at least a little bit of thickness. Then at the same time though, make sure that the collision padding is not too high. So here you can see it's fine. It doesn't create unexpected collisions. Then usually it's a good idea to use the bullet word scale to scale the whole thing up. And when you do that, very often you get a better result with less jiggling when you increase the substeps. Doesn't have to be 100, but everything increasing or increased makes it better. Here it's still a little bit of jiggling with 40, but a much better result around the 70 range. Let's put in 70 again because that was a nice result. There you go, that was pretty good. And when you do 100, then it's pretty stable, but it behaves again a little bit weird in this area. So play around with your substeps, but increasing them usually makes it better. So, okay, I hope this was helpful, and see you in another video. Cheers.